on that.
How was that? Anyway, I wanted to let you guys know today that in the stairwell, I was thinking about this episode. I know everybody got a kick out of that, but anywho, we are back once again. Thanks for joining us on the YouTube channel and on all of our audio channels out there. I think Ren has mentioned in the past, remember to like us, share us, and all that kind of stuff. Or, give us critiques and whatnot. We will read them. We may not listen to all of them, but we'll read them. But anyway, Solomon wrote in Ecclesiastes chapter 12, verses 13 and 14, when all has been heard, the conclusion of the matter is this: fear God and keep his commandments because this is for all humanity. For God will bring every act to judgment, including every hidden thing, whether good or evil. So I'm going to go ahead and kick it over to Ren. I believe this is another listener request episode that we're going to hit on, but go ahead, Ren.
Yeah, well, again, good to have everybody back this week. We're doing, as Ryan mentioned, another listener request dealing with the issue or the topic or doctrine, whatever you want to call it, of inherited sin. This falls under the purview of Calvinism, which is a very common doctrine and practice generally among a lot of denominations. I think more so than a lot of people probably realize that it is.
I think that's kind of a good point to make, too, that most people are like, well, I don't go to a Calvinist church, but there's a lot of influences in the beliefs that trickle down from Luther and Calvin and even a lot of your other Protestant Reformation guys.
Well, I would say anybody that believes in baptism of infants falls into that category because that's what it's.
Well, what's funny is there's some Calvinists that don't believe that.
Well,
they don't believe you should. Like there's all sorts of different flavors of it, and there's some people that are 3-point Calvinist to the TULIP, that acronym that they use, which was not original with Calvin. I don't know who it was that came up with it later, but it kind of summarizes the basic tenets of Calvinism. TULIP, I'll just go through it since I mentioned it. T is the total hereditary depravity. U is unconditional election. L is limited atonement. I is irresistible grace. And P is perseverance of the saints. And I think...
Didn't we do an episode
breaking that down?
Yes, we did.
I think so.
It's been maybe a year or two.
Yeah, it was either last season or the season before that. I can't remember. It probably wasn't last season. Because when I think about last season, the only thing I can think about is Revelation. But
even into this season.
I wonder why. I'll go back and look.
Okay. But we go into and break all of those things down in that episode. So if you want to listen to more on those different things, feel free to do that. But finish this episode first, if you're already listening to this one. The inherited sin doctrine or original sin, it kind of falls into the
season 3.
Oh, season 3.
It was a 2-parter.
Oh, really?
Yep.
Okay.
Towards the end of the year, November timeframe. So.
Okay, so it's been
November
longer
23.
Ago. Yeah.
Yep.
2.5.
Year and a half. Yeah.
I said a year or two, so of course it'd be right in between the two things.
Well, we could say, 3 or 4 years, because that's the whole time we've been doing the podcast and just cover all the bases.
It's in there somewhere.
Yeah.
It's been within the last few years.
But the idea of inherited sin or original sin, I think, kind of falls under the general umbrella of total depravity, because you kind of arrive at the doctrine of total depravity based upon this idea of inherited sin and original sin. Mm-hmm. And I kind of want to define the terms there before going into this discussion, because, again, there can be, depending on who you talk to, there can be different, I call it flavors of this, different interpretations of this. When it comes to inherited sin or original sin, the general idea is that when Adam and Eve sinned in the garden, specifically Adam, it so corrupted, their nature that it also corrupted our nature. And that's the idea of where, we have a sinful nature and things like that. That's where that idea comes from, which we'll talk about that. At least I plan to talk about that more later. And so there's some who say that it was just the nature that was corrupted, but others do go so far as to say that we also inherited the guilt of Adam's sin, which is another aspect of this. And because of this, that's kind of where, as Ryan already pointed out, kind of where the idea of infant baptism comes from, because if they're totally depraved, if they're corrupt and sinful by their very nature, even though they themselves haven't done anything that was sinful, the big question that comes from that is, well, what happens when a child dies? And that ties into the unconditional election and the limited atonement and different parts of the TULIP acronym there. But it was interesting. I actually saw yesterday afternoon, I was on YouTube and I came across a Lutheran church live stream out in Arizona. Why that was put on my feed, I have no clue. But I clicked on it and I saw a little bit of this guy's lesson. I don't know if it was a sermon. It seemed more like a Bible class. But he was talking about how they'll only baptize an adult if that adult has come to faith. Now, his understanding of what salvation was and everything, I don't agree with. But I was like, that's a little bit of common ground, because I wouldn't baptize somebody unless they had come to faith as well. But then he turns right around and he says, we do baptize infants. And it's kind of like, what?
How do you correlate those two?
Yeah, but I think it goes back to this doctrine of original sin and total depravity. Y'all have anything on that kind of clarifying terminology, anything?
I was just going to kind of get into some of the verses that people use to kind of prove this case. The main one that I've heard is Psalm 51 and verse 5. I think it
depends on what translation you're using, though.
Yeah. Yes, it very much
Actually,
does.
I should have got it before we started.
I'm in the ESV for this particular one that says, "Behold, I was brought forth in iniquity, and in sin did my mother conceive me." And then if you go a few chapters later in Psalm to chapter 58 and verse 3, "The wicked are estranged from the womb; they go astray from birth, speaking lies." So these are two that I've heard that kind of would quote unquote
they're
seem
kind
to
of
indicate.
the bread and butter type passages.
The versions that I think, I don't say cause confusion, are the ones that say I was born with sin, or
Well, I have
give that concept.
In that stack of Bibles behind Robbie, I have an NLT. It's that kind of brownish one, right above. Yeah, that one. And in that, I believe it says, "For I was born a sinner," I think is how they even translate that.
I think NIV.
NIV is very Calvinistic.
Yeah, that says like I was
so does
born in iniquity or something like that.
The version that I
Born
did
in
for the logo. What do we call our verse? Our not logo,
Theme?
but theme verse. Yeah. I'm pretty sure that it's the Christian Standard. It says, "Indeed, I was guilty when I was born. I was sinful when my mother conceived me." So it's even a little different.
Yeah.
My point there is that, and we've said it in the past in our versions episode, is that all of these versions are written by men.
Yeah.
So they're all going to have some variance, but also weigh it against the rest of the Bible. So I'm not condoning this version. I think what I read from Ecclesiastes chapter 12 was spot on with anything else that we've read. But case in point, if I read this and someone else read this, I could say, well, this has got some Calvinistic leanings to it, just like the NIV and the New Living. But anyway. Yeah. But I think that's the point there, is that if you read it from the ESV, the King James, the New King James, the American Standard, the New American Standard, they all say, "In sin my mother conceived me," which could be all he's saying is maybe when I was conceived it was through a sinful act. Yeah. We don't really know. It's just that he's not saying what they're trying to convey.
Yeah. Well, I think too, context is always important.
Yeah.
For one, we need to recognize that this is poetic literature. It's Hebrew poetic literature. It's not always meant to be taken literally, but also the context in which this particular psalm was written, I think, is incredibly important, which this was added, by tradition and things like that, but we have it in our Bibles. But at the beginning of Psalm 51, before you even get into verse 1, it says, "To the choir master, a psalm of David, when Nathan the prophet went to him after he had gone into Bathsheba," which that takes you back to 2 Samuel 11 and 12, and you see how They were at war, but David didn't go out to war with them. And he went up to the roof of his palace and he was looking. He saw Bathsheba. He kept looking at her. He brought her to the palace. They slept together. He killed Uriah, her husband, in order to cover up his adultery. Just this, honestly, probably the biggest blot that we think of when we think of David's life is what he's writing about when he pens this psalm. Mm-hmm. And so I think he's really, I really think that he's speaking kind of hyperbolically here and exaggerating his condition. Was that
I
too
just think
fancy of a word?
No, because I think I read that almost as that phrase
really?
somewhere. It might have been an Apologetics Press article.
Okay.
So I may have looked it up at that point in time. I'm not sure.
Well, hyperbole, it's just an exaggeration for the sake of emphasis. And I kind of think, well, in fact, if you stay in this
Is your
psalm.
last name Webster, just by chance?
No.
Merriam?
No. But in verse 8, it says, let me hear joy and gladness. Let the bones that you have broken rejoice. Yeah. Nobody takes that literally. Mm-hmm. And then, I think it was actually Psalm 58 in verse 3. I was going to go to that one as well. Because he says there, the wicked are estranged from the womb. They go astray from birth, speaking lies. They use that passage to support the Calvinistic idea, but you can't take that literally because no baby comes out of the womb speaking lies.
Right.
So there is an exaggeration to prove a point, and I think what he's saying here, he's just describing, I guess, his remorse and kind of how he views himself. I think of this on par with Paul in 1 Timothy chapter 1, I think it's verse 15, where he calls himself the chief of sinners. I don't think Paul was literally actually the worst sinner that's ever lived up until that point, but he's speaking again, exaggerating how he felt about himself prior to his conversion to Christ. And I think David is doing the same thing here.
Right. Yeah, I agree. I think especially when you read them in full context, you can it's pretty obvious that it's hyperbolic language, but it's figurative language. But the point is kind of what you were saying. I was going to use the word, it's just showing his like true grief and emotion and kind of like his feelings are just kind of being poured out through his writing. And I think that's what you see in both of those passages. But also another one that that proponents of this will point to is, I think I've got it here in Romans chapter 5.
Oh, the Adam?
Or no, Romans chapter 7 here.
Oh.
Well,
like Romans 5 at some point.
Romans, yeah, we can get to that one in a minute. But Romans
Romans.
chapter 7, particularly verse 18, speaking of Paul, it says, "For I know that in me, that is in my flesh, nothing good dwells. For to will is present with me, but how to perform what is good I do not find." And this is in context like Paul saying like, "Oh, wretch that I am, like the good that I want to do, I do not do, but what I hate, I practice."
Yeah.
So he's, living a sinful life himself, but wanting to do what is right. And so we see that kind of, internal struggle, that emotional side of Paul in this. I don't think verse 18 by any stretch is talking about that, anything of original sin there. I think it's just Paul pouring out his feelings. In Romans chapter 5 kind of is another one that they'll point to. I would argue that it kind of makes the opposite point in chapter 3 and chapter 5. So we'll kind of get to that, but particularly Romans chapter 5 and verse 12 says, "Therefore, just as sin came into the world through one man, and death through one sin, and so death spread to all men because all sin." Now, I think the last three words of that kind of disprove that idea, but the first 3 quarters of that verse talking about how sin entered through Adam, and so everybody kind of, quote unquote, inherited sin because Adam sinned, and it spread from that point forward.
But to your point, the last part said death
Because
spread
all sin.
Because all
not
sin.
because Adam sinned, but
Right.
because all
And
sinned.
if I think if you were to follow that logic, if you look at verse 19, it says, "For as by one man's disobedience the many were made sinners, so by the one man's obedience the many will be made righteous." If we inherited Adam's sin, then would we not then inherit Christ's righteousness? But I guess because we're not physical descendants of Jesus, I don't know if that's how they get around that or not. But the last 3 words, like you mentioned, it answers that whole idea of what he's talking about, because he goes back to the fall. What Adam did is he introduced sin into the world.
which introduced death into the world, which is what he said.
Right. And then all of us after that point, we've been born into a world where sin existed. And so then over time, if we live here long enough, we all eventually choose to sin.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore, in that way, again, Adam brought death, and by him many were made sinners in verse 19. But it's not because we inherited his sin or the guilt of his sin, or he somehow corrupted our nature, which again, I want to talk about that later. It's not any of that. It's because we were born into a fallen world, and we eventually all choose to sin.
Mm-hmm. Right, yeah. And I'm sure we'll kind of get more into it, but even a few of the conversations I've had with those who believe in this doctrine will even point to like the first part of Ephesians chapter 2, where it talks about that you were once dead in your trespasses, and I think verse 3 says something about like living in the passions of your flesh, or carrying out the desires of the world or something.
I mean, we could go there because that's the passage that I wanted to hit on when it comes to the nature argument that they make. Because I'll just read verses 2 and 3 there. Well, I'll start in verse 1.
It's only one line. So.
Yeah. And when you were dead in the trespasses and sins in which you once walked, following the course of the world, following the prince of the power of the air, the spirit that is now at work in the sons of disobedience, among whom we all once lived in the passions of our flesh, carrying out the desires of the body and the mind, and were by nature children of wrath like the rest of mankind. And they'll especially hone in on that word nature, and they'll say, see, it's by our very nature. When Adam sinned, he corrupted our nature. Therefore, we don't really have a choice in sinning. We're born with that nature. But what's interesting is, first of all, if you look at the first part of verse 2, it says, in which you once walked. And he's talking about something that they did, something that they practiced. And I think that's confirmed with his use of the word nature there. Because the word nature there, it can mean, and I think we have to admit, it can mean like natural order of things, like creative order or something like that. But it also means basically by like a habit, like a long-standing habit that you have developed. And I think that's more so, and I think that interpretation of that fits better with all of these other passages that we've looked at and will look at that deal with this. He's not saying you were born with that nature, but by your actions, by your life, by your habits, you were children of wrath like everybody else.
Mm-hmm. Right, yeah. I mean, I agree. And with all of these, I think it's important to not cherry pick parts of verses or even like an individual verse and framing your entire theology based on that, and to especially read like the full context of these, because especially in the case of Romans chapter 5, if you read Romans chapter 5 in its full context and come away with the concept of original sin, then you haven't read it that closely to see the point that Paul's actually making there.
I think the distinction that I like to make there is, I think that there are natural desires that God gave us. And even James talks about it's those desires that when we give into them is, we're led away by our own desires. And then when we give into that temptation, that's when sin is conceived or born, whatever you want to call it there. And then that leads to death. I don't think that, if you read Romans chapter 3, verse 23, all men have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. So I don't think we naturally are, to your point, coming in with sin, but I think because of our desirous natures and our weaknesses, which Christ said the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak, and Romans chapter 7. That I don't want to say naturally we will sin, but we're going to. And I don't mean it in in that way. It's like it's my nature. But there are desires that God gave us, and that is, in reality, when James says that, that's what tempts us, is our desires. So, if something doesn't desire us, there's no, typically there's no temptation that we could sin over. I guess you could, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, it takes work to sacrifice what we want to do what God wants. And even, I picked Lucas up from daycare today, and his babysitter told me that he got frustrated with one of them today, one of his classmates at school, I guess, probably over a magnet tile or something. And he said he got mad and he kind of whacked him a little bit. So,
Where did he learn
Which-
that,
You know,
Robbie?
you know,
Where did he learn that?
Chloe showed me a video, or she told me about a video one time that she was watching from this, like, I guess, Christian YouTuber mom influencer thing.
Uh-huh.
And she was like, children are what convinced her that Calvinism, that we're born totally depraved because of stuff like that.
Yeah. Well, but yeah, all that to say that, not, that's just like a natural thing for human nature. It's not like a sinful part of us. It's just that, we want what we want kind of thing. But in context, when we, especially in Ephesians chapter 2 there and throughout other parts of the New Testament for that matter, the point that he's making, the same one that he's making in Romans chapter 7, is that we have this internal struggle to either choose to follow God or to follow after our own desires.
And isn't it in Romans 7 where he talks about that without the law he was alive, but then let me see. I think it's chapter 7 where he says that.
I think I had that one too somewhere.
He talks about
Romans, how about verse 7 there?
Yeah, that's probably it. He says, "What shall we say then, that the law is sin? By no means, yet it had not been for the law, I would have not known sin. For I would have not known sin, what it is to covet if the law had not said, you shall not covet." Oh, no, it's verse 9 specifically. Yeah. He says, "I was once alive apart from the law, but when the commandment came, sin came alive, and I died." What does he mean by that if he's born with a sinful nature and he's totally depraved? How could he have been alive apart from the law? And then when the commandment came, he died. He wasn't born before Moses delivered the law.
And also, if it entered through Adam and there was no law,
Yeah,
that makes that a little bit more confusing too.
But one last thing about the nature thing. It's interesting that Paul uses the exact same word in Romans chapter 2 in verse 14 when he says, "For when Gentiles who do not have the law by nature," exact same word in Ephesians 2 and verse 3, "do what the law requires, they are a law to themselves even though they do not have the law." How is it that Gentiles could do by nature, same exact Greek word, do what God requires even though they did not have the law? That makes no sense.
Opposite nature, but different result.
Yeah.
Yeah, good question. The reason that I brought up verse 7, though, in Romans chapter 7, is kind of making that same point that if it was not for the law, then we wouldn't know what sin was.
Yeah.
And
Well, I mean, he says that in chapter 3, he says it in chapter 5. I mean, chapter 3, verse 24, by the works of law, no human being will be justified in the sight, since through the law comes knowledge of sin. So, and I think he's talking there is, to your point, the Gentiles had a law in them to themselves. There was moral law. Patriarchs had a law to a certain extent. God told them what he wanted. Knowing good and bad.
Yeah.
That's the point. And I think, can an infant know between right and wrong?
No, and they
Because
can't come to faith in Christ either.
Well, yeah, agreed. And I was going to the definition John gives us in 1 John chapter 4. That sin is the transgression of the law. Is that right?
First on 3:14.
3:14. Okay, I have it here, but I couldn't find it in my
right. And while we're on that kind of idea, I also
verse
had
4.
had
Chapter 3, verse
4.
4.
Okay.
Everyone who makes a practice of sinning also practice lawlessness. Sin is lawlessness, or other versions say transgression of the law, which means you have to know that there is a law and a standard, and
then
you
you
have
choose to
transgressed.
break it.
And an infant doesn't
know the
have
law.
that.
Yeah.
So,
Right. And he makes the same point in Galatians chapter 3, too. That was the one I was going to bring up to kind of hit this point home a little more, is verse 19 says, "Why then is there the law? It was added because of transgressions, until the offspring should come to whom the promise had been made, and it was put in place through angels by an intermediary." But if you jump down to 21, is the law then contrary to the promise of God? Certainly not. For if a law had been given that could give life, then righteousness would indeed be the law. But Scripture imprisoned everything under sin, so that the promise by faith in Jesus Christ might be given to those who believe. So this kind of hits that same point home, is that the law is what teaches us what sin is. And, my 2-year-old, it'd be hard to teach him about this right now,
Yeah.
especially while he's hitting his classmates on the head.
Ephesians, is that where he talks about being the tutor?
Galatians
Oh,
3.
Galatians.
Yeah, is where he talks about being the tutor.
Oh, yeah, it's right after those verses. If I
Right,
kept
verse
reading there,
24 maybe? Yeah, verse
Yeah.
24. So then the law was our guardian until
Yeah.
Christ came in order that we might be justified by faith. And in the broader context, of course, he's talking that, faith is greater than the law, but it also makes the point and the connection between the law that's brought up in Romans and in John's letters too. So
Yeah. To kind of go along with that, talking about, because we didn't use the terminology, but the age of accountability type of a concept. It reminds me of passages, Ecclesiastes 7 and verse 29, where Solomon says there, "See this alone, I found that God made man upright, but they have sought out many schemes." I think some translations say there, God made man right, but he has turned aside. So there again is that idea of we're made upright, but then we choose to leave. Isn't it? It's Romans 3. Where that famous passage where it says, "There's none righteous, no, not one," and he's making the point there that they don't even seek after what is good or anything like that. I think that's another one of those sugar stick passages.
Verse 10.
Yeah,
None is righteous, no, not one. No
but
one
if you back up just a little bit, in verse 12, well, I guess it's right after that. Excuse me. If you keep reading. It says, "All have turned aside together. They have become worthless. No one does good, not even one." And that's a quote from Psalm 14 and Psalm 53. And so it's there again, the idea, even the passages, oftentimes the passages that they use to teach this idea, if you look at the verses before to the verses
full
right after
context.
it clarifies what
they're
he's
talking about.
meaning
Yeah.
by that.
Especially in Romans, each of the, we brought up chapter 3, chapter 5, and verses in chapter 7 that will be used to promote this idea. But if you read, even reading those full chapters together, but, verses before and after, it clarifies, sometimes even in the same verse.
Yeah.
Because all have sinned.
Yes.
Well, I think the other thing is there's also Old Testament passages that cover this same thing. I mean, because I think the antithesis verse that was given to us was Exodus 34,
6 and 7.
which I don't want to get to yet, but they will use verses from the Old Testament, but there's plenty of Old Testament passages that says the one who sins, that's who's responsible.
Yep.
So it's not just the New Testament. We can find that same response in the Old Testament. And when we get to that verse, I think we'll have an explanation of what's really happening there.
Well, what's interesting, you saying that reminded me, I was watching a video earlier today, and it was done by, it was actually Don Blackwell and my uncle. They did an episode together, and it was about, I think it was the sinful nature specifically. But Don Blackwell in that lesson made the point that Jewish people don't believe in this idea of inherited sin or total depravity, which they're basing, their beliefs are largely based off of the same Old Testament that you and I have, especially when it comes to the creation account and the fall of man and things like that. But yet they don't arrive to that same idea and teaching. I think that's interesting.
Which is one of the verses that I had was, you can find it in 2 Kings 14, verse 6, or 2 Chronicles 25, verse 4, and this is King Amaziah, who, when he got full power, he went and had the men who killed his father. And it said there that, but he did not put to death the children of the murderers, according to what is written in the book of the law of Moses, where the Lord commanded, fathers shall not be put to death because of their children, nor shall children be put to death because of their fathers, but each one shall die for his own sin. So to your point, he is practicing, and he was one of the quote unquote good kings, or gooder. Sorry, Jason. One of the better kings of Judah. So and he's following the law there.
Yeah. Y'all have anything else on that?
Not particularly. Whenever we get to Exodus 34, I made myself laugh. Right before we started, I had kind of a split screen of Bible Gateway and then Bible app, so I could do two verses at once. And I was reading the verse that we had brought up in, Romans chapter 3, just a moment ago. But I thought that it was in Exodus chapter 34 for a minute. I'm like, I didn't know that was there, but I was just reading from the wrong version. So it made myself laugh. Like a minute later, I was like, oh, wait a minute. I just illiterate, but
Yeah.
did you guys have anything else that we wanted to bring up before pivoting, I guess, to Exodus 34?
Not particularly. I think we should go because this passage was one of the ones in the request that was specifically mentioned that we deal with. And it goes perfectly with the example that you just brought up, Ryan, because in Exodus 34, for a little bit of context, Moses is on Mount Sinai. God has agreed. If you read the end of chapter 33, you see that God has agreed to basically reveal himself to Moses. But he was going to pass before Moses, which this is, and crazy to think about this happening.
Mm-hmm.
God was going to reveal himself, like literally show Moses himself. But he does say that he wouldn't be able to look at his face because, as he says at the end of chapter 33, no man can look on the face of God and live. And so he covers Moses' eyes, if you will, as he's passing by him, but then Moses is able to see his back. But as he's doing this, God is declaring to Moses who he is. And he says in verse 6, the Lord, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, but who will by no means clear the guilty. Now this is, I think, this part in question, yeah. Visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children and the children's children to the third and fourth generation. Well, Ryan, you just read that it was in the law for the son or the children to not be punished for the father's sins or crimes and vice versa. But yet here God is saying he's gonna visit the iniquity of the fathers on the children, and not just the children, but the grandchildren and the great-grandchildren. And for 4 generations, he was going to visit that iniquity. So how do we rectify that?
Well, I think there's a couple of things. Number one, when you look at the word, it can mean punishment rather than the guilt, which goes, when we're talking about inherited sin, there are things that someone could do that you deal with the repercussions of, but you don't carry the guilt.
Yeah.
I think of, I immediately think of Ahab. When Ahab took Naboth's vineyard, and for hold on, I should have my notes ready.
It's
Chapter 18-ish.
Chapter 17 or 18.
Chapter 21. Chapter 21. First Kings chapter 21. At the end,
it was after.
He warned him that, or he told him, "I'm going to bring disaster on you." And when you get to the end of the chapter, Ahab repents, and God recognizes that and said, okay, I'm not going to bring disaster on you, but I'm going to bring it on your kinfolk, that your descendants, right? Well, God knew, because we got to remember,
He's omniscient.
He's omniscient. He knows what's going to happen. And if we read about his son, who is Ahaziah, the son of Ahab, began to reign there in 2 Kings chapter 22, it said he did what was evil in the sight of the Lord and walked in the way of his father and in the way of his mother, which was Jezebel, who also was not the greatest, and in the way of Jeroboam. Well, I'm trying to, but who made Israel to sin. So God knew that his son
was going to be
just as wicked.
Yeah.
So moving that punishment from someone, and he knew that he wouldn't repent, or you know what I mean? He knew that he could see what was going to happen, and relenting on that, passed it on to his son. Now, it doesn't mean he carried the guilt, but he's also getting punished for his own sins as well.
Well, that's what I would say is I wouldn't say that he was getting punished for Ahab's sins. He was getting punished for his own sins. God was, just as you were pointing out, able to see that ahead of time. Yeah. Because Ahab repented of his sins. Now, I don't know if he finished out his life.
I don't either,
God,
but
when God forgives, he forgives. He's not going to forgive Ahab and then punish his son for what Ahab did, even though God had forgiven Ahab. But again, God's omniscience. He foresaw Ahaz was going to be wicked, and because of that, he was going to bring that destruction on the northern kingdom. I also think of other examples. There's a difference between the word you used that I like to use is repercussions. there's a difference between repercussions and punishment. Because repercussions is kind of like a ripple effect. It's like, it's just
Happens.
consequences that you suffer because of somebody else's actions. I think of Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. I think they're examples of what we're talking about here because they were taken away into captivity, but I don't think that God was punishing them specifically. They just happened to be in the nation when it got to the point where God said, okay, I have to punish these people now. And then they ended up getting taken away into captivity. Because we see in Daniel chapter 1, which I know y'all have been studying that in the adult class on Sunday mornings. I mean, those 4 men, and presumably others with them, were righteous before they entered Babylon, and they continue to be righteous after that point. And so I don't think being taken away into captivity, they were being punished for sin, but they just happened to suffer.
They were in the crossfire.
Yeah, the repercussions of everybody else's sin. Also, David's son is another example I think about with this.
The other example I had, which was the children of Israel after the spies, because God said, I'm not letting you. As a matter of fact, God was going to destroy them, and he told Moses, I will raise a nation from you that's greater than them. And Moses goes back to this same verse that you just read, and he says, but you're a God that, that forgives, visiting the iniquity of the generation. So what he did is he said, okay, you're going to go live in the wilderness for 1 year for each day, so 40 years, right? And he said, none of you in this generation are going to make it. He said, but your children will. Yeah. And he said here in verse 33, and your children shall be shepherds in the wilderness 40 years and shall suffer for your faithfulness, for your faithlessness, until the last of your dead bodies lies in the wilderness. So I think you see the same concept there is they were suffering.
Their children had to suffer because of their parents. Yeah.
And so that's the other thing that I thought of. But he didn't. But he still let that group go to the promised land. Yeah. So there was a suffering, but they didn't lose everything.
Yeah.
Right. I was just going to. Just in a broad sense, the automatic chapter I went to was in fact Romans chapter 5 when it talks about sin entering the world, and so there's certain effects that we have to deal with because of sin entering the world through Adam, but we're not responsible for the eternal punishment of if Adam's going to be eternally punished, then, we're not responsible for Adam's sin, for Noah's, for anybody from the Old Testament, but there's certain decisions and things that happened in the Old and the New Testament that we see the effect of today, whether those be negative or positive effects. Same thing, when you look at it from generation to generation. The children of Israel, how many times did they go through this cycle where, God expected certain things of them, perhaps they made a covenant, and then they broke the covenant, and there was punishment for the current generation that would have carried over somewhat into the next generation. Not that they were responsible for it, but natural consequences.
I mean, they were in captivity. The Southern Kingdom was in captivity for 70 years. There's going to be kids born during that captivity.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
So it's not.
I think, but to your earlier point, it's not that Daniel. Or Belteshazzar and
Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah.
Yes.
Yeah. Using their Jewish names.
Yeah, it's not that they were responsible.
Yeah.
But they were caught up in the consequences, I guess you could say. Yeah.
It's kind of like, this is maybe a little bit down a rabbit hole a little bit, but just like, when we change presidents, there's things that might happen towards the end of ex-president's term. And then, we have a new election, a new president takes over in January. It's not that person's always, the new president's responsible for what happened before, but they might still have to deal with a lot of the issues. I mean, right now, like the egg price thing. I mean, now I'm not going to get into whose fault that is, but it's obviously something that's been an effect that's lingered on. So, stuff like that happens, housing crashes, bad economies, all of those things. You can, quote unquote, blame the previous generation if you want to, but the fact of the matter is that, the ripple effect of that is going to be in the current administration to deal with it. And in the similar way, whether we're talking about different generations of the Israelites or Christians in the New Testament or even us today, there's certain things that we are dealing with that's not necessarily any of our fault.
Yeah.
Well, not necessarily, that's not our fault, but we are still going to be dealing with those things. You know, for example, none of us were around at the time of Adam. None of us inherited that sin because we weren't alive yet. And, your verses in Kings kind of hit that point home, as does Romans chapters 3, 5, and 7.
Yeah. Another kind of example that I think about, I think the example of the president is a great example. But I think about, I have some family members, their biological mother, while she was pregnant with them, did drugs and drank alcohol and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
And so when they were born, they went through symptoms of withdrawal. So they suffered, but it wasn't because they had done anything that was wrong. It was because their mother had. So there is a very big difference between, being punished because of sin, which Hebrews 12 does say that God disciplines us.
Yeah.
But there's a difference between being punished for sin and then, like we're talking about
Dealing
here,
with the
just
effect of
happening, the consequences of it.
I think you even we could go down a whole lot of different secular examples of this, but you've got a home of, let's say, like drug addicts. There's children born as a result of that into that kind of lifestyle. They're obviously going to deal with it, though it's not their fault of the decisions that were made beforehand.
Right.
Unless they choose to kind of follow down those same path. But they also have a choice to,
I think that's a great
break
example.
the chain. And we see that in the Old Testament as well.
Yeah. And we could probably all think of people that were born into that type of environment. And there were people who chose to go along with it and got caught up in it themselves. And then there were people who were born into that environment, saw how horrible it was, and they were able to get out. They chose to not get involved with the drugs and all of those things. And basically, that's an analogy of what we're talking about when it comes to Adam. We were born into that scenario where there's sin and evil and wickedness. And all of us at one point choose to go along with it, but then we can also choose to escape it. Yeah.
Right. And I even just the conversation that we're having here, you think of like all of the kings in the Old Testament too, how there for a while there it was bad king after bad king, several generations in a row that followed after, their own selfishness, their own greed, whatever desires they had. And then, every now and then you'd have some good kings that broke the tradition for a little bit. And whether we're talking about kings or even, the Israelites as a whole during some of those stretches, you have people like Ezra and Nehemiah and Esther that come forth after the captivity that, kind of break that chain as well. So, you could look to several examples of this, in my opinion, that kind of show that even though they're dealing with the effects, some of them deal with it in a very effective manner.
Well, and I think that, and I don't know that Ahab is the best example to your point. Even though he repented in this situation and God relented from what he was going to do, not 100% sure that he remained that way. Even thinking about the Ninevites, they repented for a season and then returned back to their wicked ways. And I know there's an example of a good king whose son wasn't good, and I don't know who it is at this point, but I know there's one.
Yeah. I think about in the inverse of that is Josiah, because his father was wicked, but he himself was righteous.
That's breaking the cycle.
Yeah.
My point was someone could break the cycle, and then the very next person could decide that, I'm going back to it, and it's that decision one way or the other. Ahab, it says that when he heard those words, he tore his clothes, put sackcloth on his flesh, fasted and lay in sackcloth, and went about dejectedly. There was no question that he was sorry for how he had acted and for what he had done. And did he not end that cycle, at least temporarily there?
Yeah.
I think he did. But I was going to the point of saying, even though a cycle's broken, someone can get back into that cycle just as easily, I think. But again, it's not because the devil made me do it.
Right.
It's the choice.
It's not because Adam made me do it.
Well, that too. Yeah. But it's it's our choice.
Yeah.
Right. I just had found a list real quick on here. Hezekiah might have been one that could fall in, that he was a good king, and then Manasseh, the next one, went back to doing evil.
Which
or Josiah.
Manasseh's interesting because later he repents too. So
And a lot of these,
kinda
it can be a little bit of a seesaw in their own lives too.
Yeah.
Which is that's kind of human.
Yeah, it is.
I don't almost say
kinda-
human nature.
Yeah.
I don't want to say that, but that's what we deal. Romans chapter 7. I mean, it's that we're not going to be perfect, and we struggle with that. You know, seesaw effect is. I think you said that a minute ago with the key. But it's a decision. I don't think we can go to, well, see, I'm predestined to sin. Yes, maybe that's such a hard word. I'm waiting for Ren to blow out some 17 letter, that means sin, and I'm waiting for it. But
the only thing I've ever said was synecdoche. It's not that big.
no,
of a deal.
last week you said something because that's when he tried to repeat it and got it wrong. I was listening to that when I was running this this last week, and I was like, that cracked me up. Robbie tried to say, that's what I said. I don't even try to say
I feel like
it,
this happens like on a monthly basis, and then he's like, "What are you guys talking about?" He's like gaslighting us over here.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
I had
I
another
just
one.
have a bad memory.
Yeah, well, me too, especially when it comes to vocabulary.
That's the problem.
I did remember another verse that kind of I thought of part of this conversation was even Noah, but particularly in 1 Peter chapter 3, and it talks about how the world at the time was so evil and so sinful, but Noah was the one that made the conscious choice to kind of break that chain loose and really choose to follow God, him and his family. So that was another one that I kind of, particularly verses 18 through 20, kind of talk about that point in 1 Peter chapter 3.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say that I want to look at Jesus's view of children as well. I think points to how can you get around the view that the two places, Mark chapter, I didn't write it down, Matthew chapter 18 and Mark chapter, Mark chapter 10, verse 14. In both cases, he says that in Mark chapter 10, let the children come to me, do not hinder them, for to such belongs the kingdom of God. Truly I say to you, unless you turn and become like children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. And in Matthew chapter 18, truly I say to you, this is verse 3, unless you turn and become like children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. So why would Jesus tell them to turn
You need to become like these totally depraved little...
Yeah, exactly. Now, maybe they would argue, well, they took care of that when they were born, but I don't think that's the point. He's saying the innocence, the humility, and all that kind of stuff is what he's talking about.
Yeah.
So
that it wouldn't make any sense if that's what if we are born totally depraved and inheriting Adam's sin or sin nature even. I do want to hit just very quickly. I know we're getting close on time. I did want to hit on the other passage that was requested for us to look at in Ezekiel 18. I think we've already pretty much said what is said in this chapter, but just to hit on it specifically, the specific verse that was given to us was Ezekiel 18 and verse 4, where he said, behold, all souls are mine. The soul of the Father as well as the soul of the Son is mine. The soul who sin shall die. And basically, that's like the whole point of the remaining part, all of the rest of this chapter is, and he's talking about sin. The person who sins, like in verse 20, the soul that sins, it shall die. You know, the Father's not going to be punished for the sins of the Son, and vice versa. But what's interesting is if you back up to verse 2, the Lord comes to Ezekiel and he asks Ezekiel, what do you mean by repeating this proverb concerning the land of Israel? The fathers have eaten sour grapes and the children's teeth are set on edge. As I live, declares the Lord, this proverb shall no more be used by you in Israel. And basically what that proverb means, the fathers have eaten sour grapes and the children's teeth are setting edge, is they were trying to push the blame for their punishment and their suffering on their fathers. Like basically, we didn't do anything, it was our fathers. That's why we're suffering all of this. And God's saying, no, you're not going to be able to say that anymore. And he sets the record straight throughout the whole chapter that it's not.
That's Isaiah, right?
Ezekiel 18, but I think
Isaiah 31:29 has that same concept of the the grapes and the teeth on his
Yeah,
edge. And right after that, he goes into the very next verse talking about the new covenant that he's going to have.
Yeah.
So I thought that was interesting how that tied in there. Going back to Exodus 32, which is 2 chapters before 34, this was when Moses had been up on the mountain, and he comes back down, and they had created the golden calf. And Moses is like pleading with God, and he's like, he said, and Moses returned to the Lord and said, alas, this people has sinned a great sin. They have made for themselves gods of gold. But now if you will forgive their sin, but if not, please blot me out of your book that you have written. And Moses is saying, if you won't forgive them, blot me out of your book. And God's response was what? He said, but the Lord said to Moses, whoever has sinned against me, I will blot out of my book. So even if you want to take it, well, Jesus did, but he had the ability to do that. But I couldn't take it if I wanted to. I don't think. I don't think we see that.
Either.
I think you're responsible for it. And
I think Paul says something similar in the book of Romans, where he says, I myself could wish that I were accursed from Christ for my kinsmen according to the flesh. And so it's kind of that idea of like, he's saying, I could wish that if it was possible, but I would do it, but it's not possible. And that again, to me, there was a debate. Some of y'all, I know you've watched some of it. Some of y'all may have watched it as well on GBM with Aaron Gallagher. And one of the things that was said, because there's Calvinism, and then we would be called Pelagianists because they accredit the free will doctrine to a man named Pelagian.
There's the word of the day.
That's a man's name, okay? It's not a...
And I knew how to say it, too.
Yeah.
So.
But they credit him with being the one that really kind of started this doctrine of free will that, we believe in. And really Augustine was around that same time. Augustine and Pelagian really kind of, I don't know if went to war would be a good description of it, but they were really at odds with each other. Because Augustine is where you can trace a lot of the Calvinistic ideas of like total depravity and all of these types of things, where a lot of it finds its roots. But in one of those debates, the man that Aaron was debating was basically accusing people who hold the beliefs that you and I do of blaming other people for our sins. And he says, well, we teach and we believe that, we only sin because somebody else influenced us to sin. So it's really their fault. Well, going to James 1 and verse 14, we're tempted by our own lusts. And also, we can be influenced by other people to sin. That's what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15 and verse 33. Evil company corrupts good morals.
Isn't that what Satan did to Eve?
Yeah, it is. But I say all of that to say this. In my view, I think Calvinism really pushes the blame more so than what we believe. Because they say the reason I'm born sinful is not because of anything I've done. It's because of what somebody else did. And I'm born in this and I don't have any choice. I don't have an option. I don't have any choice. And it's because of what somebody else did. That pushes the blame. And that's what God is dealing with in Ezekiel 18. You can't push the blame. You're guilty of your own sin.
Well, I think if you read that full chapter too, I mean, was it the next few verses that says if he has not oppressed anyone, if he's not robbed anyone, if he's not done all of these things, jumping down to verse 9, if he has walked in my statutes and kept my judgments faithfully, he is just, he shall surely live, says the Lord God. If he begets a son who is a robber, shedder of blood, or all of these bad things, they will kind of spin that to say like, well, he's, proving the point that if, a son's sinful, it's because of the father. The point that he's making in all of this is, that parents need to teach their children, the right principles and morals and how to live. And we see that again reiterated in the New Testament, Ephesians chapter 6, Colossians 3, I think, somewhere close to there. Even I had up here 2 Timothy 3 specifically. We kind of see a pattern. 2 Timothy 3, beginning in verse 15, talking about Timothy, and how from childhood you have been acquainted with the sacred writings, which were able to make you wise for salvation through faith in Christ Jesus. Verse 16, here's the result. All scripture is breathed out by God and profitable for teaching, for reproof, for correction, for training in righteousness. That's how children can use it. And then 17, the effect of using it, that the man of God may be complete, equipped for every good work.
Yeah.
So we see, there's several places in the Old Testament we don't have time to look at that also hit this same point of teaching the godly principles to the next generation. Now, whether that generation chooses to accept them or reject them, as we'll see in multiple points in where are we at? In Ezekiel chapter 18, we'll see in various points that it's on the individual person to decide. But the point he's making, if he's being critical of the previous generation, is because that they were not properly taught those things, or that it wasn't carried out for whatever reason. Kind of similar to like how it talks about teachers in the New Testament, how not many of you ought to be teachers, for there'll be a harsher judgment. Same thing in a sense with parents too, that if we don't teach correctly, we're going to have to answer for why we didn't teach those godly principles to our children one day. So that's kind of, I think, the point that he's also saying previously in chapter 18 of Ezekiel.
Yeah, definitely. Y'all have anything else before we close out?
I had a quick thing. Right. Obviously, we've talked about like several reasons that don't make sense for this, but a few that I kind of jotted down. This is from a website I forgot to write down, but not original to me. But if
plagiarism,
well, I'm giving due credit. Just I don't know who to give the due credit to. But if it were true, Adam passed sin without having original sin. So, what category would Adam fall under? Number two, God never said original sin was part of the curse. If we were to go forward to Genesis chapter 3, he doesn't mention anything of that. Third reason, if we're born corrupt, it's not possible for us to become corrupt over time since we're born into it. Psalm chapter 14 talks about that. Galatians chapter 5 and 6, 1 Timothy 6. So if sin corrupts us, how can it corrupt us if we were already corrupt in the first place? Fourth reason, you cannot pass on a righteous nature. We kind of talked about that already. And then the last two I had here is original sin cannot account for like certain Old Testament people passing on sin. Adam's son was Abel, who was seen as righteous. Noah was seen as righteous. So that righteousness is also passed on, or, that morality is passed on. Original sin also says you have no choice. We talked about free will. And you had brought up, I was saving this kind of for the very end, but you had brought up that the Jews don't really consider the doctrine of original sin. But Christians also didn't either until the 16th century when this was starting to be taught. But it's really been more of a modern thing, which we see in a lot of
hundreds with John Calvin.
And when we've talked about some of the other apologetic topics, day-age theory, progressive creation, all these, we'll call them quote-unquote liberal ideas, they began during that kind of Enlightenment period, Reformation, Renaissance. All of those things are kind of coinciding with one another. Scientific revolution, where things are being more focused on secularism and philosophy rather than on religious principles. And some of the byproduct is that sometimes those two things were tied because of compromises that were made that should have never been made. So that was the only thing I was going to throw in, but a lot of things in addition to those 6 or 7 things that don't make sense.
Yes. But like we said, if you want more information on this, we did do a 2-parter, you said back in season 3?
Yep, the end of season 3,
So if you want to check that out, check that out. If you have any comments, questions, if you disagree with us, just leave a comment on YouTube, whatever.
Be nice.
Yeah, try to be. But if you have any other topic suggestions, you can reach out to us at theconclusionofthematter@yahoo.com. Reach out to us personally, Facebook, message us, talk to us in person, however you see fit to get in touch with us. But for now, we can say this is the
Conclusion of the matter.